close your eyes and listen. It is not the sound of birds or the bustle of a market that fills the air of Moscow on this April morning in 1682. It is the tolling of the Ivan the Great bell tower, a deep, rhythmic iron groan that vibrates in the very marrow of your bones. This is the kolokol, the voice of Russia, and today it carries a singular, terrifying message. The Tsar is dead. But in the shadow of the Kremlin's red walls, death is never just an end. It is a fuse. Beneath the gilded domes, the air is thick with the smell of unwashed wool, black powder, and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. This is not a story of a peaceful transition. This is the story of a city about to be swallowed by its own protectors. This is the beginning of the 1682 Streltsy Uprising, a 3-day fever dream of blood and vengeance that would forever scar the soul of a young boy named Peter, whom the world would one day call the Great. To understand the chaos, we must first look at the man who lay cold upon his bed. Tsar Fyodor III was a man of delicate constitution but a progressive mind. He had spent his brief 6-year reign attempting to drag Russia out of its medieval stupor, abolishing the archaic system of precedence known as mestenischevo, which saw noble families bickering over seating charts while the empire stagnated. But Fyodor's body could not keep pace with his ambitions. When he drew his final breath on April 27, 1682, he left behind no heir, no clear instructions, and a power vacuum so immense it threatened to collapse the very foundations of the Romanov dynasty. In the 17th century, the Russian court was a labyrinth of shadows, and at the heart of this maze were two rival families, bound by the blood of the late Tsar Alexis, but divided by a visceral, burning hatred. On one side stood the Miloslavskys, the kin of Alexis's first wife Maria. They represented the old guard, the established order, and they rallied behind the 15-year-old Ivan. But Ivan was a frail youth, plagued by physical infirmity and a clouded mind, deemed by many to be unfit for the crushing weight of the crown. On the opposing side stood the Naryshkins, the family of Alexis's second wife, Natalya. Their champion was her son, the 10-year-old Peter, a boy who was the polar opposite of his half-brother. Peter was robust, loud, intensely curious, and possessed an energy that seemed to vibrate through his very skin. As the bells continued their mournful tolling, the Boyar Duma, the council of high-ranking nobles, gathered in a feverish hurry. The decision was not merely political, it was existential. If they chose Ivan, the Miloslavskys would rule through him, and the progress of the last decade might be undone. If they chose Peter, the Naryshkins would ascend, led by the formidable Natalya and her clever advisor, Artamon Matveyev. With the blessing of the patriarch, the decision was shouted to the crowds gathered in Cathedral Square. Peter was Tsar. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the Naryshkins had won. Natalya was named regent, and the Miloslavskys were pushed into the cold periphery of the court. But they did not go quietly. In the darkened corners of the Kremlin, a woman of extraordinary intellect and iron will was watching. This was Sophia Alekseyevna, Fyodor's sister. Sidelined because of her gender, Sophia possessed a political mind sharper than any of her male relatives, and she knew exactly which weapon to unsheath to reclaim her family's glory. That weapon was the Streltsy. The Streltsy, or the Musketeers, were the first professional standing army of Russia. Established by Ivan the Terrible, they were a distinct social caste. They lived in their own settlements, or slobody, across Moscow, where they operated shops and businesses during peace, and carried their iconic long-handled axes, the berdish, and heavy matchlock muskets during war. By 1682, however, the Streltsy were a wounded beast. They were poorly paid, often seeing their wages diverted into the deep pockets of corrupt colonels. They felt their status slipping away as the government began to favor new Western-style regiments. They were tired, hungry, and deeply resentful of the boyars who looked down upon them from their limestone palaces. Throughout early May, Moscow became a pressure cooker. The heat of the coming summer seemed to bake the tension into the very timber of the houses. Sophia and her Miloslavsky agents began to move through the Streltsy quarters like ghosts, whispering poison into receptive ears. They didn't talk about grand politics, they talked about survival. They told the musketeers that the Naryshkins were planning to abolish their privileges, that the boyars were mocking their poverty, and most dangerously, they whispered that the Naryshkins had poisoned Tsar Fyodor and were now strangling the rightful heir, the young Ivan. The air in the Streltsy quarters grew thick with the scent of cheap vodka and conspiracy. The soldiers began to ignore their officers, gathering in large, unruly crowds. They marched to the Kremlin gates, demanding the back pay they were owed and the punishment of their most hated commanders. On one occasion, they even forced the government to publicly whip several colonels in a desperate bid for appeasement, but it wasn't enough. The Naryshkins, perhaps blinded by their sudden ascent, failed to see that these small outbursts were not the fire itself, but merely the smoke. By May 14th, the rumors reached a fever pitch. The story had evolved. The Naryshkins were no longer just usurpers. They were traitors to the faith, puppets of foreign influence, and the murderers of the Tsar's blood. Sophia Alekseyevna stayed in the shadows, her influence invisible but absolute. She knew that the Streltsy did not need a formal command to act. They only needed a reason to explode. The morning of May 15, 1682, dawned with an unnatural stillness. The sun rose over the Moscow River, casting long, bloody shadows across the cobblestones of Red Square. Inside the Kremlin, the Naryshkin family was celebrating their newfound power, oblivious to the fact that the fuse had finally burned down to the powder. Suddenly, the silence was shattered, not by the church bells this time, but by the frantic, dissonant beating of drums from the Streltsy quarters. The sound was a rhythmic thunder that rolled through the city streets, growing louder with every passing second. To the Kremlin, the cry went up. Thousands of Streltsy, clad in their vibrant red, green, and blue caftans, poured out of their settlements. They were not marching in the orderly lines of a parade. They were a torrent. The sunlight glinted off the curved blades of their axes and the barrels of their muskets. They were fueled by a potent cocktail of legitimate grievance and fabricated lies. At the head of the mob, agitators screamed that Ivan had been murdered, that the Naryshkins were at that very moment carving up the remains of the Romanov dynasty. As the wave of armed men reached a holy gate of the Kremlin, the guards, who were themselves Streltsy, did not lift a finger to stop them. They simply stepped aside, allowing the mob to flood into the sacred heart of the empire. The sound of thousands of boots on the stone was like a landslide. Inside the palace, the air shifted from triumph to pure, unadulterated terror. Natalya Naryshkina, holding the hand of her 10-year-old son Peter, heard the roar of the crowd rising from the square below. She looked out from the windows of the Terem Palace and saw a sea of steel and angry faces. The Streltsy surged into the inner courtyard, their voices coalescing into a singular, terrifying demand. Show us the Tsarevich Ivan, show us the traitors, give us the Naryshkins. The boyars inside the palace huddled in the corners, their fine robes suddenly feeling like shrouds. Artamon Matveyev, the veteran statesman who had seen Russia through dozens of crises, stood frozen. He knew that if the crowd was not calmed, the stones of the Kremlin would soon be stained red. The doors of the palace groaned under the weight of the mob pressing against them. The 1682 Streltsy Uprising had officially begun, and the world of the young Peter was about to be torn asunder by the very men sworn to protect him. The air was thick with the scent of the coming storm, and as the first door splintered, the history of Russia took a violent, irreversible turn into the dark.
The splintering of the door was not merely the failure of oak and iron. It was the audible fracture of the Romanov dynasty's fragile peace. As the wood groaned and gave way, the inner sanctum of the Terem Palace, a place of incense, hushed prayers, and ancient ritual, was invaded by the raw, metallic scent of the street. Natalya Naryshkina, the Tsaritsa mother, felt the vibration in the very soles of her feet. She knew that the walls, thick as they were, could no longer provide sanctuary. The myth of the Tsar's untouchable divinity was dissolving in the heat of the mob's breath. Beside her, the 10-year-old Peter stood unnaturally still. His eyes, already large and expressive, were fixed on the door. He did not cry. He did not hide. He simply watched, with a terrifying, precocious intensity, as the world he was born to rule began to melt into chaos. Natalya understood with the instinct of a cornered animal that to remain hidden was to invite a massacre. If the Streltsy believed the rumor that the Tsarich of Ivan had been strangled by the Naryshkins, they would burn the palace to the ground to find his ghost. There was only one gamble left to play: the truth. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she gripped Peter's shoulder, and then turned to the frail, half-blind Ivan. The boy was confused, his pale face a mask of exhaustion and sickness. He was the unintended center of the storm, a pawn whose supposed death was the pretext for a revolution. Together, the three of them, the Dowager Tsaritsa and the two boys who both held the title of Tsar, moved toward the Red Porch, the Krasnoye Kryltso, which overlooked the square where the sea of red-clad musketeers churned with murderous intent. As they stepped out onto the elevated stone landing, the wall of sound from below hit them like a physical blow. Thousands of Streltsy, their uniforms stained with the dust of the city and their faces flushed with vodka and rage, looked up. For a heartbeat, the cacophony died away into a heavy, suffocating silence. There before them stood the dead prince. Ivan, supported by his stepmother, looked down at the men who had come to avenge him. Peter stood at his side, his small hand gripping the hilt of a ceremonial dagger he was far too young to use. The visual evidence was undeniable. Ivan lived. The pretext for the uprising had been stripped away in the bright, unforgiving light of the May afternoon. Artamon Matveyev, seeing a flicker of hesitation in the eyes of the soldiers, sensed a narrow window of opportunity. He was a man of the old world, a statesman who believed in the power of hierarchy and the weight of a well-placed word. He stepped forward onto the porch, placing himself between the royal family and the abyss.
His voice, seasoned by decades of diplomacy and command, rang out over the courtyard. He spoke to them not as rebels, but as the Tsar's own. He reminded them of their long history of service, of the honors bestowed upon them by the late Tsar Alexis, and he promised that if they laid down their arms and returned to their barracks, their grievances regarding back pay and the cruelty of their colonels would be addressed. For a moment, it seems the spell might hold. The older Streltsy, those who remembered Matveyev's steady hand in years past, began to murmur among themselves. The pikes lowered. The collective pulse of the mob seemed to slow. But the Miloslavsky faction, watching from the periphery and whispering into the ears of the more radical musketeers, could not allow the fire to be extinguished so easily. Prince Mikhail Dolgorukov, the hot-headed son of the Streltsy's commander, committed the fatal error that history would never forgive. Emboldened by what he perceived as the mob's submission, he stepped to the edge of the porch and began to scream insults at the men below. He ordered them to disperse immediately, calling them dogs and threatening them with the knout and the gallows. It was the spark in the powder magazine. The fragile piece shattered instantly. The mob did not just roar, it screamed. The Streltsy surged forward, a tidal wave of red wool and sharpened steel. They scrambled up the stairs of the Red Porch with a ferocity that bypassed all logic. Matveyev, the voice of reason, was the first to be consumed. He was seized by dozens of hands, his noble robes torn as he was hoisted into the air. Peter watched, his eyes wide and unblinking, as his mentor, the man who had brought Western ideas and culture to the Russian court, was hurled over the balustrade. Matveyev fell into the forest of upturned pikes below. The sound of the steel meeting flesh was buried under the cheers of the soldiers. He was butchered in seconds, his body reduced to a heap of crimson rags on the cobblestones. The Red Porch, once the stage for imperial ceremony, became a slaughterhouse. Prince Dolgorukov followed Matveyev into the abyss, his arrogance silenced by the same pikes he had threatened his men with. Inside the palace, the doors were finally breached. The Streltsy did not enter his soldiers, they entered as hunters. They were no longer looking for the Tsarevna Sophia, they were looking for the traitors, the Naryshkin kin who had supposedly usurped the throne. They rampaged through the gilded halls, their muddy boots trampling over fine Persian carpets, and their halberds splintering the delicate wood carvings of the Tsarevna. Natalya Naryshkina retreated into the inner chambers, clutching her children to her chest, but she could not protect her brothers. Afanasy Naryshkin, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, was discovered hiding behind the altar in the palace chapel. The sanctity of the church offered no protection. He was dragged out by his hair, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. The Streltsy dragged him to the square, where he was subjected to a people's trial that lasted only as long as it took to sharpen an axe. The air in the Kremlin grew thick with the smell of iron and wood smoke. Every corner of the palace seemed to echo with the screams of the dying and the rhythmic chanting of the musketeers, who had found a terrifying new sense of agency. Throughout this nightmare, the figure of Sophia Alekseyevna remained a shadow in the corridors. While the Naryshkins bled, she moved with a calculated, glacial calm. She did not lead the mob, but she did not stop them. She was the architect of the silence that followed the screams. To the Streltsy, she began to emerge not as a helpless princess, but as the only member of the royal family who understood their righteous anger. She fed them names. She pointed toward the shadows where the Naryshkin influence still lingered. The uprising was no longer a spontaneous burst of violence. It was a systematic purging of the old guard, cleared away to make room for a new architect of power. As the first day of the uprising drew to a close, the Kremlin was a fortress under siege from within. The bodies of the highborn were piled in the square, serving as grisly monuments to the shift in the Russian political landscape. The young Peter, escorted back to the safety of the inner rooms, remained silent. He had seen the pikes. He had seen the blood of his mother's family painting the stones of the home he thought was invincible. The nervous tic that would plague him for the rest of his life, a sudden, violent twitch of the face and neck, manifested in the flickering candlelight of the nursery. He was a boy who had seen the absolute fragility of the crown and the absolute power of the bayonet. The 1682 Streltsy Uprising had not just changed the government, it had forged the soul of a future emperor in the fires of a palace coup. But as night fell over Moscow, the violence was far from over. The list of traitors was long, and the Streltsy had only just begun to whet their appetite for the blood of the boyars. The darkness of the night was merely a veil, behind which the next phase of the terror was already being whispered into existence.
The whispers of the night did not dissipate with the coming of the dawn. Rather, they coalesced into a chilling mandate for further purification. The sun rose on May 17, 1682, over a Moscow that had been transformed into a charnel house, yet the Streltsy felt their work was unfinished. The blood of Matveyev and Dolgorukov had served only to sharpen their blades and embolden their rhetoric. In the minds of the musketeers, they were no longer a mutinous militia, but the Holy Guard, the self-appointed cleaners of a house gone rotten. Within the Kremlin's thick stone walls, the air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of dried blood and the suffocating scent of incense from the chapels where the terrified nobility prayed for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely to manifest. The primary target of the second day's fury was Afanasy Naryshkin, the younger brother of the Tsaritsa Natalya. To the Streltsy, Afanasy represented the very essence of the Naryshkin infection, a young, ambitious man whose proximity to the throne threatened the traditional order they claimed to defend. For hours, the palace was subjected to a systematic room-by-room scouring. The guardsmen moved with a rhythmic, heavy-booted precision, overturning heavy oak tables, slashing through priceless Flemish tapestries, and prying up floorboards with the points of their halberds. They were searching for a man they believed was hidden behind the very walls of the royal apartments. Tsaritsa Natalya, her guise hollowed by a sleeplessness that felt like a permanent state of being, huddled with her remaining kin. She could hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the Streltsy boots approaching her private chambers. It was a sound that would haunt her dreams until the day she died. The guards eventually reached the Church of the Resurrection, a sanctuary they had previously respected. But the sanctity of the altar was no longer a barrier. They demanded Afanasy. They threatened to burn the entire Kremlin to its foundations, with the young Peter inside it, if the traitor was not surrendered. In an act of agonizing desperation that defied maternal instinct yet was born of it, Natalya was forced to watch as her brother was discovered. He had been hiding in a small space behind the altar, his face pale as the wax of the surrounding candles. He was dragged out into the light, his hands bound with the very silken cords meant to hold back the church curtains. The execution of Afanasy Naryshkin was not a swift affair. It was a public ritual of humiliation. He was taken to the Red Staircase, the symbolic heart of the Kremlin's authority, and cast down into a forest of waiting pikes. The Streltsy did not merely kill him, they dismantled him, a physical manifestation of their desire to dismantle the Naryshkin influence over the Russian state. As his broken body was dragged across the cobblestones, the mob let out a roar that reached the ears of the young Peter, who sat shivering in a nearby room, shielded by the trembling arms of his tutors. The boy was learning a lesson that no textbook on statecraft could provide, that the legitimacy of a Tsar was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the roar of a common soldier. While the streets ran red, a different kind of power was being forged in the quiet, shadow-drenched corners of the Terem Palace. Sophia Alekseyevna, the 25-year-old sister of the deceased Tsar Fyodor, was not a victim of this chaos. She was its architect and its ultimate beneficiary. For years, Sophia had lived in the stifling seclusion mandated for royal women, her sharp intellect and formidable will constrained by tradition. Now she saw the Streltsy as the lever she needed to move the world. She did not hide from the guardsmen. Instead, she stepped into the vacuum of power with a terrifying composure. She began to meet with the leaders of the regiments, including the charismatic and volatile Prince Ivan Khovansky. Sophia understood the Streltsy in a way the Naryshkins never could. She knew their grievances were not just about traitors, but about a deep-seated fear of being replaced by a modern, westernized army. She promised them security. She promised them gold. Most importantly, she promised them that they would be the ultimate arbiters of the new regime. By May 18th, the Streltsy's demands had evolved from simple executions to a fundamental restructuring of the Russian monarchy. Encouraged by Sophia's supporters, they marched to the Uspensky Cathedral and presented a petition that sent shockwaves through the Boyar Duma. They demanded that Russia have not one Tsar, but two. They wanted Peter to remain, but they insisted that his elder half-brother, the infirm and nearly blind Ivan V, be crowned as the first Tsar, while Peter would be the second Tsar. This was an unprecedented arrangement, a diarchy that theoretically balanced the competing claims of the Miloslavsky and Naryshkin families. But the Streltsy went further. They demanded that Sophia be appointed as regent, the acting head of state until the boys reach maturity. The Patriarch Joachim, a man caught between his duty to the church and the cold steel of the muskets, found himself presiding over a series of concessions that stripped the crown of its absolute dignity. To the Streltsy, the dual-tsardom was a masterstroke. It ensured that neither faction could fully dominate the other, leaving the guards as the tie-breaking power in the middle. To symbolize this new, bloody era of justice, the Streltsy demanded the construction of a monument in the center of Red Square. They called for a great stone pillar to be erected, a pillar of shame or pillar of justice, depending on which side of the halberd one stood. On this pillar, they insisted on engraving the names of all the boyars they had slaughtered, listing their alleged crimes against the people. It was a permanent record of their victory, a stone testament to the day the musketeers had broken the back of the nobility. Moscow became a city of two worlds. Within the Kremlin, the court lived in a state of gilded imprisonment. Every meal was eaten with the knowledge that the guards outside the door were also their jailers. Every decree signed by the young Tsars, often guided by the steady hand of Sophia, was a reflection of the Streltsy's will. Outside the walls, the city was gripped by a strange, festive terror. The Streltsy paraded through the streets, their red coats stained with the grim of the coup, being hailed by some as heroes of the old faith and the old ways. They had succeeded in freezing time, halting the encroaching tide of Western reform that the Naryshkins had represented. However, the alliance between Sophia and the Streltsy was a pact written in water. Prince Ivan Khovansky, the man who now led the regiments with an almost king-like authority, began to see himself as more than just a general.
He began to envision a Russia governed by the sword and the ancient traditions of the old believers, the religious dissenters who had been persecuted by the state for decades. The Kovanchina, as this period of his dominance would later be called, was beginning to spiral out of Sophia's control. The Streltsy were no longer satisfied with being the protectors of the crown. They wanted to be their masters. As the month of May drew to a close, the physical violence began to subside, replaced by a psychological siege. The young Peter, though officially a Tsar, was a ghost in his own palace. He watched as his mother, Natalya, was stripped of her influence, her relatives dead or exiled, her future entirely dependent on the mercy of a stepdaughter who despised her. Peter's nervous twitch grew more pronounced, a visible mark of the trauma he was internalizing. He spent his days in the shadowed hallways, watching the Streltsy drink and boast in the courtyards below. He was a boy who was learning the art of the long game. He said little, but he observed everything. The way the guards held their pikes, the way the bureaucracy bent to the loudest voice, and the way the stone pillar in the square served as a reminder that history was written by those who held the gates. The 1682 uprising had achieved its immediate goal. Sophia was in power, the Naryshkins were broken, and the Streltsy were the lords of Moscow. But the air remained electric with unresolved tension. The old believers were preparing to challenge the church. Khovansky was preparing to challenge Sophia, and in the quiet of the nursery, a young boy was preparing for a day when he would no longer be the second Tsar. The pillar in the square was meant to be a monument to a finished revolution, but as the summer heat began to bake the city, it became clear that the fire of 1682 was still burning, and the next eruption would be even more transformative than the last. The Streltsy had opened the gates of chaos, and they would soon find that closing them was a task beyond the strength of any halberd.
The heat of July 1682 did more than just stifle the air of Moscow. It fermented the ambitions of those who believed the revolution was their personal property. Prince Ivan Khovansky, the man who had ridden the wave of Streltsy fury to become the de facto master of the capital, now found himself in a position of precarious brilliance. He was the Batko, the father of the regiments, a man who believed that the young czars were merely puppets and the regent Sophia was a temporary necessity. To the common musketeer, Khovansky was a savior who had humbled the boyars and secured their pay. To Sophia, however, he was becoming a monster of her own creation, a rival who threatened to turn the Kremlin into a barracks where the whim of the soldier outweighed the law of the Romanovs. This period, known to history as the Khovanchina, was a fever dream of political instability. The Streltsy, emboldened by their success in May, began to see themselves as the ultimate arbiters of Russian life. They patrolled the streets with an air of surly entitlement, their red coats stained with the dust of the city and the wine of the taverns. But the political vacuum they had created was soon filled by a force even more volatile than military grievance, religious fervor. The old believers, those who had never forgiven the church for the reforms of Patriarch Nikon decades earlier, saw the chaos of 1682 as a divine opportunity. If the civil order could be overturned by the halberd, perhaps the spiritual order could be restored by the cross. At the center of this spiritual storm was Nikita Pustosyat, a charismatic and uncompromising priest who led the old believer faction. He found a sympathetic ear in Khovansky, who saw the religious dissidents as a useful tool to further isolate Sophia and the Naryshkins. On July 5, 1682, the tension reached a breaking point. The old believers, supported by a significant portion of the Streltsy, marched into the Kremlin, carrying their ancient icons and books, demanding a public debate on the faith. They didn't want a quiet theological discussion. They wanted a spectacle that would force the state to renounce its reforms. The debate took place in the Palace of Facets, an arena of gold leaf and flickering candlelight. It was a scene of surreal intensity. On one side stood the young czars and Sophia, representing the continuity of the state and the established church. On the other side stood Nikita and his followers, shouting and waving their fingers in the two-fingered sign of the old cross. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and incense. Sophia, showing the steel that would define her regency, did not flinch. When the old believers grew violent in their rhetoric, she threatened to leave the city and take the czars with her. It was a masterstroke of political theater. If the czars left, the Streltsy would lose their legitimacy and their source of income. The musketeers, realizing that their religious sympathies were about to cost them their livelihoods, turned on the old believers. By the next morning, Nikita was arrested and executed, and the religious uprising was snuffed out. But Khovansky remained. His arrogance had only grown. He began to drop hints that his own bloodline was as ancient and noble as the Romanovs, suggesting that perhaps a change of dynasty was not unthinkable. Sophia realized that as long as she remained in Moscow, she was a hostage to Khovansky's whims. In late August, she began a slow, deliberate exodus. Under the guise of a traditional religious pilgrimage to the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius, the royal court moved out of the capital. It was a strategic retreat that the Streltsy failed to recognize as a declaration of war. From the safety of the fortified monastery and the surrounding estates, Sophia began to summon the provincial gentry and those regiments of the army that remained loyal to the crown. The second Tsar, Peter, watched this maneuver with a quiet, observant intensity. He saw how his sister played the long game, how she used distance and time to erode the power of a man who thought he was untouchable. The Streltsy in Moscow began to panic. Without the presence of the Tsars, they were no longer the guardians of the throne, they were merely rebels in a city that was running out of food and patience. In September, Sophia struck. She sent a summons to Ivan Khovansky and his son Andrei, inviting them to a royal audience at the village of Vozdvizhenskaya. Khovansky, perhaps blinded by his own ego, or perhaps believing that his popularity made him immune to arrest, traveled with only a small escort. He was intercepted on the road by loyalist troops. The man who had dominated Moscow for 4 months was hauled before a makeshift court. There was no long trial, no defense, and no mercy. The charges were treason and plotting against the lives of the Tsars. On September 17th, his birthday, Ivan Khovansky and his son were beheaded in the dirt of a village square. The news of the execution hit Moscow like a thunderclap. The Streltsy, leaderless and terrified of the approaching provincial army, collapsed into a state of frantic submission. They realized that the Batco was gone, and that the regent was no longer the frightened woman who had watched her family butchered in May. They sent delegations to Sophia, begging for forgiveness, promising to serve with unwavering loyalty if only their lives were spared. Sophia, demonstrating a pragmatic cruelty, accepted their submission. She allowed them to keep their lives, but she stripped them of their political influence. The stone pillar they had erected in Red Square, the monument to their victories, was torn down. The names of the boyars they had murdered were cleared, and the records of the uprising were burned or rewritten. The 1682 uprising was technically over, but its echoes were destined to shape the future of Russia for a century. For Sophia, the victory was a validation of her right to rule. She would spend the next 7 years as the sovereign in all but name, navigating the treacherous waters of the Kremlin with a skill that few women in Russian history had ever matched. She patronized the arts, flirted with Western ideas, and tried to bring order to a fractured state. But she could never fully bridge the gap between the old world of Muscovy and the new world that was beginning to dawn. The true legacy of the uprising, however, lived in the mind of the boy who had survived it. Peter I never forgot the sights and sounds of those 3 days in May. He never forgot the smell of blood on the palace stairs, or the sight of his mother's protectors being tossed on the pikes of the Streltsy. To Peter, the Streltsy were not just soldiers. They were the embodiment of everything that was wrong with Russia, anarchic, superstitious, and resistant to change. The 1682 uprising became the trauma that fueled his obsession with modernization. It was the reason he would eventually build a new capital on the swamp, far away from the dark alleys of Moscow. It was the reason he would replace the red-coated musketeers with a disciplined European-style army. In 1689, Peter would finally move against Sophia, reclaiming the power she had so skillfully held. And in 1698, when the Streltsy dared to rise one last time while Peter was traveling in Europe, he would return with a vengeance that surpassed even the horrors of 1682. He would oversee the execution of over 1,000 musketeers, personally swinging the axe in some cases, and leaving their bodies to rot on the walls of the Kremlin as a final gruesome message. The era of the Streltsy was over, buried under the weight of an empire that had no room for the medieval chaos they represented. The 1682 uprising remains a pivotal, if often overlooked, chapter in the Russian story. It was a moment when the country stood at a crossroads between the traditional power of the boyars, the populist fury of the soldiers, and the emerging autocracy of the Romanovs. It was a revolution that failed to achieve its goals but succeeded in changing the trajectory of a nation. As the dust settled on the Kremlin squares and the memory of the blood faded into the annals of the bureaucracy, the stone pillar may have been gone, but the foundation of the modern Russian state had been poured, mixed with the iron of the halberd and the cold, unyielding resolve of a young Tsar who would never forget the day the gates were opened. The fire of 1682 did not just burn the city, it tempered the man who would burn the old world to the ground.